There's a weapon from World War II that the military tried to bury. They banned it. They confiscated it. They threatened soldiers with court-martial for even making it. But one day in the Pacific, when a Marine was pinned down by enemy fire with nowhere to run, he pulled out this forbidden device and wiped out an entire Japanese bunker in seconds. And suddenly, the same officers who wanted to throw him in the brig were begging him to show everyone how he made it. This is the story of the K-Ration Hand Grenade Fuse, a weapon so simple it was made from trash, so effective it changed how Marines fought in the jungle, and so dangerous that the Army wanted it gone. But before we understand why they banned it, we need to go back to where it all started, because this story begins with the worst grenade ever issued to American troops. The year is 1943. The place is Guadalcanal, and American Marines are dying because their grenades won't work. The standard issue grenade at the time was the Mark II, also called the pineapple grenade. You've seen it in every World War II movie. That oval-shaped thing with the lines cut into it. It looked tough. It looked lethal. But in the Pacific theater, it was getting Marines killed. Here's the problem. The Mark II had a fuse that took 4 to 5 seconds to detonate after you pulled the pin. In theory, that sounds fine. You pull the pin, throw it, take cover, boom, simple. But jungle warfare wasn't theory. It was chaos. When you're fighting in dense jungle, visibility is maybe 10 feet on a good day. Vines everywhere. Trees so thick you can't see the sky. And the Japanese were masters at bunker construction. They dig into hillsides, reinforce with logs, cover everything with dirt and foliage. You could walk right past one and never see it until the machine gun opened up. So when a Marine finally spotted a bunker and threw a grenade, one of two things happened. Either the grenade bounced off the logs covering the entrance and rolled back toward the Marines, or a Japanese soldier inside simply picked it up and threw it back out. Because remember, you've got 4 to 5 seconds before that thing goes off. 4 to 5 seconds is an eternity in combat. Marines were getting killed by their own grenades. The weapon designed to save their lives was being used against them, and command knew it. Everyone knew it. But the Army Ordnance Department, the guys in charge of weapons and equipment, didn't want to hear about it. They'd tested the Mark II stateside. It worked fine on the testing range. So the problem must be the soldiers, not the grenade. That's when a Marine named Louis Wilson got an idea. Wilson wasn't an engineer. He wasn't a weapons designer. He was a regular grunt who'd been in the Pacific long enough to know that jungle fighting required jungle solutions, and he'd noticed something interesting about the K-rations they ate. K-rations were these boxed meals every soldier carried. Breakfast, lunch, dinner. Inside each box was a can of meat or cheese, some crackers, maybe a chocolate bar and cigarettes. But the important part was the can opener. It was this tiny thing, barely bigger than your thumbnail, called a P38, just a small piece of folded metal with a cutting edge. Wilson realized that if you took that P38 can opener and bent it just right, you could wedge it under the grenade's safety lever. Then, when you pulled the pin, the lever would stay down until the grenade hit something. Any impact would knock the P38 loose, release the lever, and start the fuse. It was brilliant, because now you had an impact grenade. The fuse only started after it hit the target. No more 4-second delay. No more time for the enemy to throw it back. The grenade would explode on contact, or close enough that it didn't matter. Wilson made one, tested it, it worked. He showed his squad. They made their own. Word spread. Within weeks, hundreds of Marines on Guadalcanal were making K-ration fuses. And then the officers found out. The first thing command did was confiscate them, every single one they could find. They went tent to tent, foxhole to foxhole, and took them away. Then came the order. Any Marine caught with a K-ration fuse would face court-martial. Not a warning, not a slap on the wrist. Court-martial, which in a combat zone could mean prison time or worse. The reasoning was safety. The Army Ordnance Department claimed these homemade fuses were unreliable. They said grenades might go off while still in a soldier's hand. They said the fuses could detonate from the vibration of walking or riding in a vehicle. They painted a picture of Marines accidentally blowing themselves up because some grunt thought he knew better than the engineers back home. But here's what they didn't say. The real reason they banned the K-Ration fuse had nothing to do with safety. It had everything to do with ego and liability. Think about it. If the Army officially acknowledged that Marines were making better grenades out of trash, it meant admitting the standard issue grenade was flawed. It meant admitting that guys with high school educations were better at designing weapons than college-educated engineers. It meant potential lawsuits, congressional hearings, and questions about how many Marines had already died because of faulty equipment. So instead of fixing the problem, they banned the solution. But Marines kept making them anyway. They just got better at hiding them. They'd make the fuses right before an operation, use them in combat, and ditch any leftovers before returning to base. Some guys kept them hidden in their packs, buried under socks and letters from home. Others would stash them in the jungle, marked with subtle signs only their squad knew about. It became this underground network of forbidden weapons, passed from veteran Marines to replacements, kept alive through whispered instructions and careful demonstrations. And the officers, most of them looked the other way, because they knew. Every lieutenant and captain who'd actually seen combat knew those K-Ration fuses worked. They knew their men were safer with them, so they'd do inspections for the paperwork, find nothing, and move on. An unofficial don't ask, don't tell policy for homemade explosives. This went on for months. Through Guadalcanal, through New Georgia, through Bougainville. Marines used K-Ration fuses and survived fights they shouldn't have, but officially the fuses didn't exist. Until April 1944. That's when the 22nd Marines landed on Eniwetok Atoll as part of the Marshall Islands campaign. And that's where a corporal named Jack Thompson proved why the K-Ration fuse needed to exist. Thompson's platoon had been tasked with clearing the northern section of the island. Intelligence said light resistance, maybe a few stragglers left behind. Easy job. Intelligence was wrong. The Japanese had fortified a command bunker so deep into the coral rock that naval bombardment hadn't touched it. It was covered by palm trees, hidden behind natural terrain, and packed with at least 11 soldiers who had no intention of surrendering. Thompson's platoon walked right into the kill zone. The Japanese opened up with a Nambu machine gun and rifles. 3 Marines went down in the first burst. The rest scrambled for cover, but there wasn't much. They were caught in a clearing with the bunker to their front and open beach to their back. Move forward, you get shot. Move back, you get shot. Stay still, you get shot. Thompson was behind a fallen palm tree that provided exactly zero protection from machine gun fire. Rounds were chewing through the wood, splinters everywhere. He could hear his guys screaming, some hit, some just terrified. The lieutenant was yelling for grenades, trying to coordinate some kind of assault, but nobody could get close enough to throw one. Because remember, standard grenades needed 4 to 5 seconds. If you popped up to throw, you get shot before your arm finished the motion. And even if you made the throw, the grenade would bounce off the bunker's reinforced entrance and roll back. They'd tried twice already. Both grenades had been thrown back out and exploded harmlessly in the sand. Thompson knew they were dead. The Japanese would keep them pinned until dark, then either overrun their position or call in mortar fire. There was no air support coming. No tanks. Just 30 Marines and a bunker that wouldn't die. That's when Thompson remembered the K-Ration fuse in his pack. He'd made it 2 weeks earlier, kept it hidden through 3 separate inspections. He'd almost thrown it away a dozen times, worried about getting caught. But something told him to keep it. And now, trapped behind a disintegrating palm tree with a machine gun trying to kill him, he was glad he'd listened. The problem was simple. He had one grenade with one K-Ration fuse, one chance. If he screwed this up, he was dead and his platoon was dead. No pressure. Thompson pulled the grenade from his belt. His hands were shaking so bad he almost dropped it. He took the P-38 can opener he'd bent into shape, wedged it carefully under the safety lever, and made sure it was secure. Then he pulled the pin. The grenade was live. The only thing keeping it from detonating was a piece of metal thinner than a matchstick. If he dropped it, if it slipped, if anything bumped that P-38 loose, he'd have maybe half a second before it exploded in his hand. He looked at the bunker, maybe 30 feet away. He'd have to expose himself completely to make the throw. Stand up, step out, full body visible to the machine gun, and he'd have to throw it hard enough and accurate enough to get it through the bunker's firing slit. That opening was maybe 2 feet wide and a foot tall. Thompson didn't think about it, he just moved. He came up from behind the log, stepped into the open and threw. The machine gun swung toward him. He could see the muzzle flash, could hear the rounds snapping past his head. But the grenade was already airborne, tumbling through the humid Pacific air, heading straight for that tiny opening in the bunker. It went in. The impact knocked the P-38 loose. The safety lever released. The fuse ignited. And before any Japanese soldier could react, before anyone could pick it up and throw it back, the grenade detonated. The explosion inside that confined concrete space was catastrophic. The blast wave had nowhere to go but through flesh and bone. Every soldier inside died instantly. The machine gun went silent. The rifle fire stopped. And suddenly, the only sound was ringing ears and heavy breathing. Thompson was still standing in the open, untouched. The machine gun had been firing at him, bullets all around, and somehow none of them hit. Pure luck, or maybe something else. Combat does strange things. His lieutenant ran up, grabbed him, pulled him back to cover. They waited for return fire. Nothing came. The bunker was dead. Thompson's platoon was saved. And he'd done it with a weapon he could have been court-martialed for possessing. The after-action report was interesting. Thompson's lieutenant knew he had to mention the K-Ration fuse. You can't leave out the detail that won the fight. But he also knew mentioning it could get Thompson in serious trouble. So he wrote it carefully, described the situation, the danger, the solution, made it clear that without that improvised fuse, the entire platoon would have been lost. That report went up the chain of command. Captain read it, Major read it, Colonel read it, and somewhere in a headquarters tent, a general read it and made a decision. Instead of court-martialing Thompson, they gave him a Bronze Star. And instead of continuing to ban K-Ration fuses, they quietly stopped enforcing the rule. It wasn't an official reversal. The Army Ordnance Department never admitted they were wrong. There was no memo saying K-Ration fuses were now approved, but suddenly officers stopped confiscating them. Inspections stopped finding them. And in some units, sergeants started teaching new guys how to make them. The dam had broken. Because once one general decided that saving lives was more important than protecting ego, everyone else fell in line. By mid-1944, K-Ration fuses were everywhere in the Pacific. Every Marine knew how to make one. Some Army units picked up the trick. Even some Navy corpsmen carried them for self-defense. It became standard jungle craft, passed down like any other survival skill. But here's the thing. The K-Ration fuse was never perfect. It was dangerous. The Army Ordnance Department wasn't completely wrong about that. Grenades did occasionally detonate prematurely. There are documented cases of Marines dying because a K-Ration fuse came loose at the wrong time. Maybe the P-38 wasn't bent quite right. Maybe it got jostled during movement. Maybe it was just bad luck. Combat is chaos, and adding improvised modifications to explosives doesn't make them safer. So why did Marines keep using them? Because the alternative was worse. A grenade that might accidentally kill you was better than a grenade that definitely wouldn't kill the enemy. It was a calculated risk, and every Marine who made a K-Ration fuse understood that calculation. They weren't stupid. They weren't reckless. They were making the best choice available in a situation with no good choices. That's the reality of war that doesn't make it into the official reports. Sometimes the standard equipment fails. Sometimes the rule book is wrong. And sometimes soldiers have to break regulations to stay alive. The interesting part is what happened after the war. You'd think the military would study the K-Ration fuse, learn from it, maybe incorporate the design into future grenades. And to their credit, they kind of did. In the 1950s and 60s, the military developed impact-fused grenades for specific situations. They were used in Vietnam, in special operations, in scenarios where a delayed fuse was a liability. But they were never standard issue. Even today, the default American grenade uses a timed fuse. Why? Because impact fuses have their own problems. They can detonate on tree branches before reaching the target. They can go off if dropped during handling. They're more complex and more expensive to manufacture. So for most situations, the military still prefers the reliability of a timed fuse. But in the jungle, in close quarters, when fighting an enemy who's learned to throw your grenades back at you, that's when you need something else. That's when soldiers start making their own solutions. And that's exactly what happened in Iraq and Afghanistan, where troops modified their equipment in ways that would have gotten them in trouble 50 years earlier, but instead earned them commendations. The lesson of the K-Ration fuse isn't that soldiers are smarter than engineers. It's that the people actually doing the fighting understand the fight better than the people observing from a distance. And when those two groups are in conflict, when the rulebook says one thing and reality says another, you better listen to the guys getting shot at. Thompson survived the war, came home, got married, worked construction for 40 years. He didn't talk much about his Bronze Star, didn't tell many people about the K-Ration fuse. It was just something he'd done, something that needed doing, and he'd been the one holding the grenade when the moment came. But other Marines remembered. Veterans would swap stories about the forbidden fuses, about the close calls, about the bunkers that wouldn't have been cleared without them. It became part of the unofficial history, the stuff that doesn't make it into textbooks but gets passed down in VFW halls and reunions. And the Mark II grenade, the pineapple that started this whole mess, it stayed in service until 1969, 50 years after it was first designed. Because changing military equipment requires admitting the old equipment was flawed, and that admission requires mountains of paperwork and testimony and someone taking the blame. So instead, they just let Marines make K-Ration fuses. The last confirmed use of a K-Ration fuse was in Korea, 1951. A Marine Corporal used one to clear a Chinese bunker during the Battle of the Chosin Reservoir. After that, they disappear from the records, maybe because better grenades finally became available, maybe because the institutional knowledge faded as World War II veterans retired, or maybe because someone finally updated the grenade design enough that soldiers stopped needing to fix it themselves. But the legacy remains. Walk into any military museum with a Pacific Theater exhibit and you might find a K-Ration fuse behind glass. It looks like nothing. Just a grenade with a bent piece of metal stuck to it. But people who know the story stop and stare because they understand what it represents. It represents every time a soldier was failed by their equipment and had to improvise. Every time a regulation prioritized appearances over effectiveness. Every time someone in authority said no and someone on the ground said, "Watch me." The K-Ration fuse is a reminder that war isn't fought by generals and politicians. It's fought by 19-year-olds with high school educations who figure out how to survive with whatever they have. And sometimes, what they have is a grenade that doesn't work and a can opener from their lunch. Thompson's Bronze Star citation is specific about one thing. It says he displayed exceptional courage and initiative in the face of overwhelming enemy fire. It doesn't say he broke regulations. Doesn't say he'd been hiding a banned weapon. Doesn't say the thing that saved his life could have gotten him court-martialed a month earlier. Because by the time the citation was written, everyone involved had quietly decided to forget about the ban. They couldn't officially reverse it without admitting they were wrong, but they could stop enforcing it, and they could make sure that Marines like Thompson were rewarded instead of punished. That's how institutions save face. They don't admit mistakes. They just stop making them and hope everyone forgets how things used to be. The military learned something from the K-Ration Fuse, even if they never said it out loud. They learned that top-down control has limits, that soldiers will adapt whether you want them to or not, that you can either work with that reality or fight against it, but you can't stop it. So modern militaries have built-in flexibility. Special operations units are given latitude to modify their equipment. Field commanders have more authority to make decisions based on local conditions. And when a soldier comes up with a better way to do something, there's at least a chance someone will listen instead of confiscating it. But it shouldn't have taken a Bronze Star action to figure that out. It shouldn't have required Marines dying to their own grenades before anyone admitted there was a problem. The K-Ration Fuse should never have needed to exist, because the Mark II grenade should have been fixed or replaced years earlier. That's the real story here. Not that soldiers are innovative or brave, though they are, but that the system designed to support them was so rigid, so afraid of admitting error, that it took a forbidden weapon and a desperate throw in a Pacific jungle to force change. Thompson was asked about it years later in an interview for a local newspaper. They wanted to know what he was thinking when he stood up to throw that grenade. What went through his mind when he exposed himself to the machine gun fire? He said he wasn't thinking about bravery or medals or proving anything. He was thinking about the guys behind him, his friends, his squad, and he was thinking that if he didn't do something, they were all going to die, so he did something. That's it, no grand philosophy, no patriotic speech, just a Marine who saw a problem and fixed it with the tools he had, even though one of those tools was banned and the other was made from a can opener. The 11 Japanese soldiers in that bunker never knew what hit them. They were fighting the same war they'd been trained for, using the same tactics that had worked before. Wait for the enemy to throw a grenade, throw it back, keep firing. Rinse and repeat. But Thompson changed the rules. He brought a weapon they'd never seen, that they had no defense against. And in the 2 seconds between when that grenade entered their bunker and when it exploded, they probably had no idea what was different. They probably reached for it, expecting the usual 4 to 5 second delay. They didn't get it. War is often decided by moments like that, not by grand strategy or superior numbers, but by one person with one idea at one critical moment. The K-Ration Fuse didn't win the Pacific War, but it won that fight, and it won dozens of other fights across a dozen other islands. And every Marine who came home because a K-Ration Fuse killed the enemy before the enemy killed them, they owe their lives to Louis Wilson and his bent can opener. Most of them never knew his name, never knew who first came up with the idea. They just knew it worked. That's how innovation spreads in war, not through official channels and approval processes, but through survival. If something keeps you alive, you use it. If it keeps your buddy alive, you teach him. And if command doesn't like it, you hide it better. The K-Ration Fuse was hidden innovation, underground technology, a weapon that existed in defiance of orders because the alternative was unacceptable. And when it finally proved itself, when it saved enough lives that even the generals had to pay attention, they didn't celebrate it. They just quietly stopped trying to kill it. That's not how we like to imagine our military. We want to believe in efficient systems and smart leadership and equipment that works the first time. We want to think that when there's a problem, it gets identified and fixed through proper channels. But Thompson's story tells us different. It tells us that sometimes the proper channels are blocked, sometimes the people in charge are wrong, and sometimes the only way forward is for someone on the ground to break the rules and hope they survive long enough to prove they were right. He did survive. The platoon survived, and the K-Ration Fuse survived long enough to become legend. There's a strange footnote to this story. In 1947, 2 years after the war ended, the Army Ordnance Department published a report on improvised weapons used by American forces in World War II. It was a thick document, hundreds of pages, covering everything from modified rifles to homemade mortars. The K-Ration Fuse got exactly one paragraph. It described the device, mentioned that it was used in the Pacific Theater, and noted that while effective, it was considered unsafe and not recommended for future use. That's it. No mention of how many Marines used it. No mention of Thompson or the Bronze Star. No acknowledgement that they'd tried to ban it and failed. Just one dry paragraph that buried the whole story in bureaucratic language. But the Marines remembered. They always do. The unofficial history, the stories told in barracks and bars, they kept the K-Ration Fuse alive. And every generation of Marines since has heard about it in some form. Sometimes accurate, sometimes exaggerated, but always with the same core message. When the book is wrong, rewrite it. When the equipment fails, fix it. When command says no and you know you're right, do it anyway and deal with the consequences later. That's not insubordination, that's survival, and there's a difference. Thompson died in 1998, 54 years after he threw that grenade. His obituary mentioned his Bronze Star but not what he'd done to earn it. Just said he was a decorated World War II veteran who served with honor. His family donated his medals to a military museum. The Bronze Star is there, behind glass next to his service photo. He looks young in that picture, just a kid, really. But that kid saved 30 lives with a banned weapon and a perfect throw. The museum doesn't have his K-Ration Fuse. He probably threw it away after the action, like most Marines did. No point keeping evidence of breaking regulations, even after you've been decorated for it. So that piece of history is gone, melted down, or rusted away somewhere in the Pacific. But the story remains. And as long as there are Marines, as long as there are soldiers who find themselves let down by their equipment and surrounded by enemies, the story of the K-Ration Fuse will matter. Because it's not really about a grenade. It's about what happens when the people fighting the war are smarter than the people running it. It's about innovation under pressure. It's about the gap between theory and practice, between what works on paper and what works when someone's trying to kill you. The K-Ration Fuse worked. That's all that mattered to Thompson when he stood up in that clearing. That's all that mattered to the 30 Marines he saved. And that's all that should have mattered to the officers who tried to ban it. But ego got in the way. Pride got in the way. The inability to admit error got in the way. And Marines died because of it, until finally one Marine with one grenade proved the point so definitively that even the generals had to shut up and accept reality. That's the legacy, not the weapon itself, but what it represents. The proof that sometimes the guy with the least rank and the most dirt on his uniform knows more than the guy with the most rank and the cleanest desk. Thompson knew. Wilson knew. Every Marine who made a K-Ration Fuse and carried it into combat despite the threat of court-martial, they all knew. The Mark II grenade was going to get them killed, and the homemade fuse might save them, and that was all the math they needed. They were right. The brass was wrong. And eventually, after enough blood and enough close calls and enough actions like Thompson's, the brass had to admit it. Not in words, never in words, but in action, by stopping the confiscations, by looking the other way, by giving Bronze Stars instead of court-martials. That's as close to an apology as soldiers ever get from their command. And honestly, it's probably enough. Because at the end of the day, Thompson didn't need an apology. He needed a grenade that worked. And when his superiors wouldn't give him one, he made his own. That's the real story of the K-Ration Hand Grenade Fuse. Not that it was banned, or that it was effective, or even that it saved lives, but that it existed at all, that it had to exist, that American Marines in 1944 were making better weapons out of trash than their military was issuing them. And that should bother us. It should make us ask questions about every other time soldiers had to compensate for failed equipment, about every other improvised solution that was born from desperation rather than design. But mostly, it should make us remember Thompson, standing in that clearing, grenade in hand, machine gun firing at him, making a throw that had to be perfect because he wouldn't get another chance. He made it, the grenade went in, the fuse worked, 11 enemy soldiers died and 30 American Marines lived. And somewhere in a desk drawer in Washington, someone filed a report about unsafe improvised weapons and never had to answer for why those weapons were necessary in the first place. Hit subscribe for more untold stories from World War II.